como tal, sino que lo reconozco como Palestina. Entonces, este hombre vive en Jerusalén y no se les permite hablar precisamente con la prensa ni salir de Jerusalén. Tiene que pedir permiso siempre a la autoridad, a los militares, al Estado. Este hombre se llama Mardochai Vanunu, que fue precisamente el que denunció la construcción, el desarrollo nuclear de Dimona, y como estamos muy sensibilizados últimamente con Irán y su desarrollo nuclear, ¿qué nos puedes decir tú de Israel y la central nuclear de Dimona? Gracias.
I can't say much more than what Mordechai Vanunu said. I mean, yes, Israel has a nuclear program, and according to most of the intelligence that's gathered, it's never official, but it has over 200 nuclear bombs, which means one of the biggest nuclear powers in the world. There isn't much to say about it. I mean, obviously, it's very phony when Netanyahu comes to the UN Assembly with a picture of a bomb for a very strange reason and says, you know, we have to stop Iran from getting nuclear bomb when he already has them. But, I mean, again, I'm not sure what can be said about it. I think that it's very clear that, again, this is a part of militarization. It's part of this idea that we have to have the strongest army and the best possible technology and the most developed ways of killing people in order to exist. And it's so fundamental that it comes to an absurd. I mean, what the hell do you do with 200 nuclear bombs? There's nothing possible you can do about defense with that kind of power, but it's just built in such a system that says we have to have everything in order to maintain our place.
Ez dakit, inoiz topatu zera zura nahiarekin aurrez aurre, beha disparatzen eta zu protesta batean?
No. No, that would have been bad. No, my brother's not a combat soldier, so that's never going to happen. It has happened for me to meet people that you know. I mean, again, I was in South Mount Hebron, which is an area south of the West Bank, which is a very rural area, and most of what the local Palestinians there live on is herding sheep and agricultural work, and there's a huge issue there with water. There's very little of it, and a lot of the water cisterns are close to settlements, so the settlers don't allow people to come to get their own water. And legally they have every right to and so on, but they come to pump their water, settlers come, call the army, and they just mainly shoo them away. So one of the times we were accompanying shepherds to their water cisterns, and the settlers came and we tried to get the water anyway, and then the army came and started to shoo us away, and you know, I'm screaming at the soldier saying, what are you, I mean, look what's going on behind you, that these people just want to get their water, that's all there is to it. You're defending, not only defending a settler policy, but you're preventing people from getting to water. I mean, that's supposed to be pretty basic. And then the guy looks at me and he says, didn't you go to this school? And it turns out he was like a class above me, and we started talking about, like, you know, oh yeah, you were a friend of that guy and like the people that we know. And then I'm like, wait, you know, we come back to reality and understanding where we stand. And again, I think it goes back to that place of that you can't put it in us and them because of that, because there's also always that personal connection, and that someone that you know that's actually just standing there, it only, as far as I'm concerned, it only makes it even crazier. Of like, I know that this person in daily life, he's an okay guy. I mean, he's a decent person, and he'll probably have moral stands on some things and so on, but this system makes him into something that, or makes his actions something that I can't possibly defend or understand.
Rachel Corrie, 23 urte zituen izanean, badakizute makina bat pasazan bere gainetik. Rachel Corrie, 2003an jarri izan makina baten aurrean, eta Zeuden palestinar etxe baten ejertzitoa, nahizune bota etxe hortatik, eta jarri izan orain gutxi, epaiketa baten ondoren sententzia atera da, eta kontra, ejertzitoa ez dula kulparik hiltzeagatik, baizik izan zala neska horrena. Hori bizi izan duzu, beha kooperante bat zan, iaia zure adinakoa, nola bizi izan duzu hau?
Well, Rachel Corrie, she was run over by a bulldozer, and not a tank. And the bulldozer, as said, it was trying to demolish a Palestinian house in Gaza. I actually had a chance to speak to her parents, who are amazing people. If you want to Google interviews with them, I mean, they continue being very active, and they were the ones who were pursuing this case as well. It was very clear, I think, for everyone.
Tiene una web con el caso. Que tiene una web en Google.
There's a website.
Okay, so there's great. And it's very clear for everyone that these kind of things will not happen in a court system. I mean, the chances for an Israeli soldier to be convicted for murder or killing or manslaughter or anything of the sort during a military actions is very small. And this was just another example to show that. I think that it's important to say that in many ways, I'm not sure if I would much rather see the commanding officer of that soldier, the one who sent him to demolish the house, or the politician making the policy stand on trial than the soldier himself. I do think that soldiers have a responsibility, and I think that responsibility shouldn't be taken away from them, but also that it's a much larger mechanism. And maybe the advantage, if we talk about the UN bid now, the advantage of the International Criminal Court, when people, if Palestine will be admitted, is that it will be able to, for the first time, bring Israeli politicians and policymakers and generals who give these orders to trial. Because soldiers have been sent to trial here and there, and sometimes even been convicted for wrongful shooting or these kind of things. But the policy itself, the mechanism, has never been challenged. And that's something that maybe the UN bid will be able to open.
Galdera bat. Zu Israeldarra izanik, palestinarrei laguntzen diazu. Palestinarrekin batera egiten dezu lana, justiziaren alde eta bar. Zer nolako erreakzioak jasotzen dituzu palestinarren aldetik? Eskerrona, mesfidantza, konfidantza, denetarik, eta zein izan da deigarriena, zuretzat atentzioa gehien deitu dizuna, beraien erantzunen artean?
Like any relationship, it's something that starts from a much more suspicious place, and with time it becomes more personal. And I can say that all these villages, if we gave Bil'in as an example, this village outside Ramallah that the Basque delegation was in, the demonstrations there started in 2004. And today there are still weekly demonstrations, 8 years later. And you can see the personal relations. I mean, the friends, every wedding that someone has, everyone's coming. I mean, it becomes that. It becomes a personal relation other than just the political one. I can just, one example that I had that was for me very powerful was that when I refused my military service, I sent a letter explaining why I'm refusing. And in that letter, I told more or less the story that I told you about this small village in Jerusalem. And my father, when I was in prison, he went to that village and he read them the letter that I wrote then. And people started crying. And he called me up when I was still in prison, and he said, that he read this and that people started crying. And for me, I mean, that kind of personal relations, I mean, for me, that was a very powerful experience of also maybe reminding myself why I'm there, and what kind of in many ways, if it goes back to what the alternative is built on that. The alternative is built on saying there is a way to, I'm not going to say live together because it has a connotation of, we can all hold hands and, the hippies of the 60s, we're not there. I mean, it's not just living together and talking to each other as human beings, but it's also, there was a Palestinian activist that phrased it as co-resistance instead of coexistence. There is a possibility, there is a place of struggling together against the occupation that exists and is very strong on a solidarity level. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where my hope is. That's where I see us going forward. If there are no more questions, I can talk about whatever I want to, but I think it'll be much more.
Lourdes.
Sí, bueno, tiene que ver un poco con la última respuesta. Hablas de la resistencia, de la corresistencia entre israelíes y palestinos a una ocupación, pero más allá de eso, cuando llegue un momento, ¿cuál es la salida al conflicto? Hay teóricos que hablan de dos estados separados, o hay teóricos que hablan de un estado laico. Ojo, porque la salida es muy importante para ver un poco cuál es la resistencia a partir de aquí, ¿no? Me parece muy importante en vuestro grupo por cuál de ellas apuesta, o si es que es una cosa que lo tenéis a futuro y con el tiempo ya se verá.
Well, first of all, as a group, most groups in the Israeli left don't have a clear position. One of the main reasons for this is that there's no clear Palestinian position that we can relate to. I mean, there isn't one call that you can say, okay, either you stand in solidarity with that or you don't. Because there's such a wide variety, it's very hard for a group to choose a way, because it will necessarily exclude people. The things that are fundamentally repeat themselves in every solution are the end of the occupation or the military rule on Palestinians, equal rights to all Palestinians, including inside Israel, and a recognition of the right of return, of the right of Palestinian refugees from 48 to return. The question of its implementation, if it's symbolic, if it's compensation, all these things are debatable, but those kind of three very basic ideas are in every solution, in a sense. If you're asking me personally, what I would like to see is, I'll go back a little. When people talk about the two-state solution, as opposed to the one-state solution, I think what people used to say is that the one-state solution, the idea of everyone from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea under one government, it sounds great, but it's not practical. And then people were talking about two states. And when you open a map today of the settlements, then you will have to say that the idea of two states might not sound the best, but it's also not practical. Right now, the settlements, there are 4 main settlement blocks, and they control 70% of the water of the West Bank. They control Jerusalem. They separate the west and the south of the West Bank, and they control the Jordan Valley, which is the only international border of the West Bank with any other country. So if there would be a two-state solution, it would be a Palestinian state with no capital in Jerusalem, no water, no territorial continuity, and no border with any other country but Israel. That's not a state. So in many ways, you kind of say that they're both not practical, which is, on the one hand, rather depressing. But on the other hand, I think that it allows us to say, okay, so if we put practicality on the side for a second, we're allowed to think what we actually want to see, and then move to how do we create that. So as far as I'm concerned, my vision is somewhere in between, in the form of a federate state, to have one federate government that does have all the laws and freedom of movement inside of it and so on that level, but that will maintain autonomous or cultural autonomy, both Jewish and Palestinians in different cities and in different areas, because first of all, I think that I mean, there are more than two different societies here, but at least two different societies here, and they do have their own ways of operating, and I think that's okay to maintain that. But instead of separating the land itself into two states and making, which is, it'll have to be a crazy zigzag of saying, okay, then the federal law can be one, and you can continue your own lives in whatever community on a different level. That's kind of my personal perspective. And that was here.
Bai, kaixo, lehenengo eta behin oso interesgarria iruditzen zait, esatean aizea dana. Nik egia esan nire bidaietan israeldar bastante ezagutu ditut, eta ez dakit esan diatena egia dan edo gezurra dan. Ironikoa da, nik entzun detena eta israeltarretako batzuk esan diatena da, zerbitzu militarra bukatzen dutenean, gobernuak bidaiak ordaintzizkiela. Osea, mundu guztian zeharra. Ez dakit egia dan edo gezurra dan. Egia esan, leheno esaten zenun beldur hori nik ikusi dut. Nire bidaia guztitan ez dut ikusi israeldar bat, bere ere, bakarrik bidaiatzen duna, beti taldetan. Eta saiatu izan ezenean hitz egiten edo, ez dakit, ezagutzen pixkat, ikusten dut horrelako barrera handi bat bezala, ezta? Osea, ez Israel eta Palestinan arazoan, hortikan kanpoa, ezta? Osea, behaien, ez dakit, bizitzai buruz edo, eta ikusten dut horma handi bat bezala, osea, itxita bezala daudela. Ez denak, baina nire esperientzia hori, jakin nahiko nuke hori. Ia zuk nola ikusten duzun hori. Osea, kanpoa bidaiatzen dutenean, jarraitzen duen beldur horrek, ezta?
Yeah, definitely. The army doesn't pay you specifically to travel the world, but when you get out of the army, you get kind of a bonus amount of money, which a lot of youth use to travel the world. And it's kind of, it's also used quite a lot to get that chapter behind you. You see, especially combat soldiers, a lot of them in India, there's a lot of cases of a lot of taking drugs and things of the sort. Some of it is also to kind of forget, but some of it not. Some of it is just, finally you're free. Until now, you were in high school. Straight after high school, you were in the army. This is the first time that you can travel the world. And a lot of people do that and then go back to normal life. It's kind of an outlet before you have to go back to, the track of university and a job and all these kind of things that we all have in our own societies in different ways. But yes, the wall of fear that you're talking about is something that, again, personally, it sometimes feels almost absurd. When I speak to my grandmother and she keeps saying, you're bringing the second Holocaust, like that's the level that people are talking on, which, on my level, I don't exactly understand how speaking to you here will forward the second Holocaust. I really don't hope that it won't. But people are seriously on that level, and part of the reaction of that, you use the fact that you use the word of a wall, closing people down, like around them, and I think it's a very interesting question of, even the physical wall is also closing Israel in a physical wall. One of the early Israeli politicians, right wing, called Jabotinsky, was talking about the iron wall. The idea was to surround Israel with an iron wall so it will be able to exist. That's the feeling. The feeling is we have to, what we call in Hebrew, live on our sword. We have to have that strength in order to exist. And obviously that completely constrains you. There's the analogy to ghettoizing, it's kind of, so if in Jewish history it was usually other nations that were ghettoizing the Jews, today they're closing themselves in from this place of fear. So I definitely agree that it's a very problematic place to be in, and people do take it wherever they go.
Lehenik eta behin, eskerrik asko, Sahar, hemen gurekin etorri egoteatik. Mi eskerre bai, Donostiko udaletxetik, udaletxeari aukera hau ematiagen. My question is more about the strategy that you use. How do you reach the youth people, like to try to convince them not to do the military service, And have you seen in the last years or in the last 10 years that it goes up, or it's stable, or it goes down? And what's like, how it's going on? Thank you.
Do you want the truth or the optimistic answer? Okay, so I mean, first of all, how do you reach people is always a question. I can say that specifically New Profile, the organization I was talking about, is the only organization in Israel that is banned from schools. There's a order from the Ministry of Education that we're not allowed into schools. Luckily, most schools don't know that, so we're okay. But it's always a challenge, and there are times that it's easier. For instance, after the second war in Lebanon, it's a very interesting thing happened in Israeli society. The second war in Lebanon was in 2006. 2007 was the lowest enlistment rate to the army in the history of Israel. And it was much less about criticism around the war on what was done to Lebanese people and the Palestinians in Lebanon, but much more for the fact that it was seen that Israeli soldiers' lives were not taken into consideration. Dozens of soldiers died. The last 3 days of the war, the ceasefire was already signed, the agreement, and yet the soldiers remained there, and again, dozens of soldiers died. I mean, there was a huge social criticism kind of saying, you just don't care about us. I mean, you demand us to go to the army and then you send us to die. That was the lowest enlistment rate ever. And in times like that in Israel, it's a little bit easier to start talking about these things. Interestingly enough, 2009, the attack on Gaza in Kartzelan, the summer of 2009, after that, was the highest combat enlistment rate in years, because the feeling was kind of the opposite. This was a war that, hard to call it a war, but as far as Israeli society was concerned, it was a war in which hardly any soldiers died. And it was like, okay, our government is at least taking care of us on that level. And then since then, it's again much harder to talk about these things. So things kind of change according to a lot of external, external issues. In general, though, the enlistment rates are going down all the time. I don't want to, I would love to tell you, but I don't want to lie to you. It's not for political reasons. The enlistment rates are going down partially for economic reasons. Most of the people who don't go to the army do it for economic reasons. An Israeli soldier gets about 80 euros a month if he's not combat, and 160 euros a month if he is combat. You obviously can't live out of that. And if you're only supporting yourself, then that's okay. The army will give you clothes and food and a place to stay and so on. If you're supporting a family, or if you're helping, if you're part of an income of a family, you literally can't afford to go to the army. And if we go back to the marginalized parts of Israeli society, the main reason, for instance, that the prison is full of Ethiopian Jews is that a lot of them go to the army, are drafted like everyone else, eventually get a phone call from home saying, we need the extra income, and then they just leave, they just desert. They just don't show up, go to work for a few months, eventually get caught, sent to prison. And I've had girls sitting with me in prison who did this 4 or 5 times. Every time they would get out of prison, go back home to work, get arrested again for desertion, go and do the system again and again. So that's a pretty big group that is growing of people who don't go to the army for that reason. And another group that it's very hard to say what are the numbers, because no one says it up front, or just people who just don't feel like it anymore. And there's less of a feeling, in the beginning of the State of Israel, there was a big, strong feeling of this solidarity. There was this like social package. It was supposed to be this social ideal place, and you were supposed to get all the like wealth care and public housing, and it was supposed to be the idea was this ideal. Yes, for Jews only, but let's put that aside for a second. And the only price is that you have to serve in the army because it's a small country with enemies all around and so on. And the more that package kind of breaks, everything is becoming more privatized, the public housing, all these things, then people are starting to feel less in debt to the country, to the state, and go to the army much less. In the last... in the tent movement, you heard it very strongly. A lot of people were saying, I'm a reserved service, I did my duty, but the government's not giving me back. So it's kind of this sense of betrayal that is also decreasing the enlistment rates.
Me gustaría que también me pudieses explicar o explicarnos a todos los beneficios que se les dan a los colonos. Eso por una parte. Y segundo, ¿qué número de reclutados en el mundo entero van jóvenes al servicio militar y luego vuelven a sus países de origen?
Okay, so about the settlers, there are two main groups of settlers, you could say. There's the what we call ideological settlers, the ones taking over hilltops in the middle of nowhere, building a little outpost, and usually the ones that are much more violent. When we hear stories about burning mosques or these kind of things, that's usually the more ideological settlers. And then the much larger group, most of the settlers are what we call economic settlers, which is exactly that. The government gives benefits. First of all, the housing in settlements is much, much cheaper. I mean, today, if a young Israeli couple want to get a house, you know, with a garden and a red rooftop and kind of the bourgeoisie dream, they can't afford to do it inside Israel. And housing in settlements is cheaper because it's subsidized by the government, because no one ever paid for the land, so makes it much cheaper, because the labor building it is Palestinian labor, and they don't have the same labor laws as in Israel. You can pay them much less. A lot of mechanisms that make it just cheaper to build there. And so people move, and that's the bulk. Also, most of the settlements are what's called in Israel a national priority zone, which is giving a kind of, if it's tax exemptions or less taxes and so on, to areas that the government wants to support. So historically, it was usually, again, the marginalized society. What we had is the townships where the immigrants were just coming in, so they got more support. Today, it's also the settlements. All the public housing in Israel in the last 20 years has been in settlements. The government, government hasn't done any governmental construction inside Israel, only in settlements. So there's all these attempts, the buses are subsidized, and so on. So this is kind of, and Israel very much tries to frame the settler movement as something doing their own thing. Like, you know, we can't stop the settlers from doing whatever they're doing. People can buy land or whatever. It's very clear that the government is pushing for it. I mean, it's a governmental effort to get more and more settlers into the West Bank. Is there another question? Ah, yes, there was.
Estadísticamente zenbat
those who serve abroad and then.
Ah, yes, I love those. Yes, there are. It very much depends on the society. I think that South Africa is the Jewish population with the highest enlistment rates to Israel, and Australia, I think, is the second one. Interestingly enough, both these populations have a very high concentration of Holocaust survivors. So these are the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So again, this whole framing of fear and the framing of something to protect us has a lot to do with people who do go to the army, and yes, they come for the 2-3 years to volunteer and go back home. I think that there's a lot to be said about diaspora Jews and about in general the Jewish community around the world and its effect on Israel. I think the strongest is obviously in the U.S. It's the easiest to see it in the U.S. There's a huge Jewish Zionist lobby that is more or less pressuring the United States government to support Israel in any way possible. But there's also a growing Jewish dissident voice, both in the US, in Europe, also in Australia and South Africa, of Jews saying that this cannot be done in our name. And I think it's always an interesting perspective and a very important one. I think it's important for two kind of opposite reasons. One reason is that I think that the Jewish voice in many ways was hijacked And there's a complete parallel between being pro-Israel, being like Jewish, pro-Israel, and pro-occupation. There's this kind of parallel that they were all drawn together. And it also means the other way around. I mean, Israel frames it so if you're against the occupation, then you're against Israel, then you're an anti-Semite. They kind of make it all as one bulk. And I think it's really, really important in general, but also for the Jewish community, to split that up and say, no, these are three completely different things. There's the occupation, there's Zionism, there's Judaism, three completely different things that Israel has combined into one. And it's really important to make that voice clear. I think that the other side of it is that because Israel tends to, every time there's some kind of protest or something, then the reaction of Israel is, well, the whole world's always against us. They're all anti-Semites, whatever. And the moment that you have a strong Jewish voice saying it, or a Jewish voice joining this voice that's already happening in the world, then it makes it much harder to say, well, it's all anti-Semitism, and it kind of gives it more of a credit in a sense. So I think that is an important development to counter these young South Africans or whoever who do join the army.
Galdera bat nire aldetik. Lehen komentatu ditugu hainbat ekintza egin direla hemendik Euskal Herritik, bai brigadistak egon dira, baita ere estel beleroa, eta planteatzen nahi da boikota Israelgo produktuei. Zer iruditzen zaizu? Eta zer iruditzen zaizu alde batetik boikota egitea, baina baita ere zer egin dezakegu, zer iruditzen zaizu egin dezakegun laguk.
Well, you answered your own question. But in general, I think that one of the things that it's been talked about around the world, but there's kind of a shift in social movements into talking more about the economy of everything. And it's very clear here in Spain, and it was clear in Occupy Wall Street and so on. And also with the Palestinian resistance, there's a shift of saying, okay, there's someone who makes a profit out of everything that's happening here. And that profit is made, it's important for me to say, not only by Israelis. Yes, the Israeli military industry makes a huge profit. For instance, the last attack on Gaza with a lot of drones were used, the planes with no pilot. That's a technology that's being sold around the world. After the 2009 attack in Gaza, France bought quite a few of these planes because they were proven to work. The Beijing police force, when it had the Beijing Olympics and had to displace 1.5 million people to make place for the Olympics, they came to Israel to train with Israeli border police to learn how to do that. Israel has become the best in weapon manufacturing. It can prove that its weapons work because they test them all the time. And in crowd control and all these things, these techniques, that is sold. So yes, Israel makes a huge profit out of it. On the other hand, a lot of other international companies also do. I don't know if you know Veolia. It's a French company, pretty big one. They do a lot of infrastructure work, garbage disposal, trams, all these kind of things. They also do the tram in Jerusalem that connects the settlements in north of Jerusalem into the city center. They also do garbage disposal from Israeli garbage that is thrown into the Jordan Valley on Palestinian land. No one can tell them not to. No one cares about the environmental reactions of this. What does it mean for the water that the Palestinians are drinking later on? So for them as an international corporation, it's someone that I know likes to call it a corporate Disneyland. It's a world with no laws, no environmental laws, no labor laws. All these things are kind of broken because it's occupied land, and it's a huge profit to be made. And on that level, that's a lot of where the shift is going. And saying, okay, if that's one of the main mechanisms that sustains this, then that's one of the main places that we should be combating it. We should be trying to breaking that and making the occupation not profitable. And as a question of how can you do that, then that's finding what in your own local communities. And it's amazing to see how much the world economy is combined, and there's not a single country in the world that's not involved in the occupation and doesn't have companies involved in the occupation. If you want to check it out, there's a website called Who Profits, which maps all the organizations and corporations that profit from the occupation, and you can find who's active here to a provincial level. I mean, you write Spain, and then you find in this specific area, and that's where things should happen. I very much believe in kind of a think global, act local. There are a lot of things that can be done in your own community of putting out a standard. We have a standard of what we want, what we're willing to give our money to. We're not going to give our money to companies that are involved in violations of human rights anywhere. And we're not gonna, and we have that standard as a community. So as far as I'm concerned, that's where it happens, and that's what the boycott movement has been doing. I think it's important to say about the boycott movement that it's not going to have, at least not in the short term, such a huge economic effect. Because the boycott movement is much more effective in consumer boycotts. It's a little bit effective in divestment campaigns of big companies divesting from their involvement in the occupation. What it's not very effective in is the question of sanctions and military sanctions and making governments to stop buying arms from Israel, which is probably where most of the money actually is. But what it is very effective is in explaining the occupation. It's a huge advocacy tool, because if you can come to a community and say, the occupation is not something far away in the Middle East that you have absolutely nothing to do with. This specific, for instance, train company that is used all across Europe is specifically involved in ruining the water of this village in the Jordan Valley. There's a direct connection between you and that makes you also responsible for it. Every single time you pay for Veolia, then you're complicit in it. Like every single time I pay taxes, I'm complicit in it. And that's a question of how can you target that and try to minimum your cooperation with it. I think that a lot of, in general, most, and this has been said a lot, but kind of most bad things can continue because people cooperate with them without even noticing. And as far as I'm concerned, as there are a lot of Israelis who say that they're against the occupation but are still serving in the army, because that's my duty and so on, that's on the same level like all these foreign governments and so on who say that they're against the occupation and against settlements and so on, and continue buying their products and continue buying the weapons that are produced around this issue. So that the idea is to end the complicity, our own complicity in it, in every level that we can.
Markatu, zein da enpresaren izena eta zein da webaren helbidea?
The example I gave was Veolia. I actually don't know how active they are in Spain, Veolia. But there are a lot of different companies, and really, you look into the website of Who Profits, you'll get every single company that's active in Spain, what they do, what their involvement in the occupation is, and what they do here. So where you can be active here. Just as examples of campaigns that have worked, there's a huge security company called G4S, it's the biggest security company in the world. It's actually also been involved, I don't remember what in Spain, but there was some involvement here. And there have been huge divestment campaigns, and it's a Danish company, and the Danish government divested from that company. The Danish government cut contracts with them saying you're violating human rights. I mean, there are huge campaigns and very effective ones that can be done around this, taking it to a local place, saying, okay, my local government won't participate in all these different corporations.
Zerbait gehiago, galderarik daude, bestela eskatuko diogu azkeneko hitza nahi baduzu esan.
usually I take this part to talk about what you can do, which we've already done. But I really think that it is important to say, I mean, militarization is not an Israeli disease. I was just a few months ago in a conference in Germany with people from over 20 countries and all different continents talking about the militarization, and it's amazing to see how many of the things repeat themselves in different countries. Obviously more in countries that have conscription and more in countries that are directly involved in combat, but in all countries. And I think that it's very important, again, to always look at it on a local level as well. How does this affect your society here? And how does what you do here with your society, or for instance with your money, also affect what's going on with us in the Middle East? And seeing these connections, I think that's something that's been growing very much internationally in the last few years. It's a huge momentum that can be joined. And on that level, again, I do urge you to check out Who Profits, find if there's anything that talks to you, that has anything to do with your life that you want to be able to campaign with, because that's kind of what we are able to do. That's it.
Mila esker Sahar, mila esker itzultzaileak, eta zuei ere bai. Hala,
Yes.
agur.